Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I've got something really special for you. I've gathered 10 spine-chilling horror stories that are guaranteed to send shivers down your spine. These aren't just any stories, they're tales that have haunted people for years. So grab some popcorn, turn off the lights, and let's dive into the darkness together. But first, a quick disclaimer. The following stories are based on real events and experiences shared by people around the world. Some details have been changed for privacy and dramatic effect. Viewer discretion is advised. It was late autumn, and the nights were getting longer. I had just moved into an old house on the outskirts of town. The locals told me it had a history, but I didn't pay much attention. That was until I started hearing the whispers. Every night, as the clock struck midnight, faint whispers echoed through the halls. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew louder and more distinct. They seemed to come from the shadows themselves, moving around the room. One night, I decided to follow the sound. Armed with only a flashlight, I traced the whispers to the basement. The door creaked open, and a rush of cold air hit me. I descended the steps, and there, in the corner, I saw them. Figures, barely visible, whispering in an ancient language. Frozen in fear, I watched as one of the shadows moved towards me. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and the whispers stopped abruptly. I fled the house and never returned. The next day, I learned from a neighbor that the house was built on the site of an old asylum. The patients who died there were said to haunt the grounds, their whispers lingering long after their demise. As a collector of antique dolls, I thought I'd seen it all. That was until I came across a peculiar doll at an estate sale. It was beautiful yet eerie, with glassy eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went. I took it home, excited to add it to my collection. From the moment the doll entered my house, strange things started happening. Items would move on their own, and I often heard soft giggling when I was alone. One night, I woke up to find the doll sitting on my bed, its eyes staring directly at me, though I had left it in the living room. Determined to uncover the truth, I researched the doll's history. It turned out it belonged to a little girl who died tragically in a fire. Her spirit, they said, was bound to the doll. I decided to return the doll to where I found it. But as I was driving, the car swerved violently as if someone had grabbed the wheel. I managed to stop the car and threw the doll into a river. The haunting stopped, but the memory of those glassy eyes still haunts me. It was a chilly winter night, and I was working late at the office. The building was almost empty, with most of my colleagues having left hours ago. As the clock neared midnight, the silence was interrupted by the sudden ring of my office phone. Startled, I answered it. "Hello?" I said, expecting it to be a wrong number or a prank call. Instead, I heard a faint, static-filled voice on the other end. It was a woman, speaking in a whisper so soft it was almost inaudible. "Help me, please," she pleaded. "Who is this?" I asked, but the line went dead. I hung up, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, the woman sounded more desperate. "They're coming! You have to help me!" Her voice was clearer now, filled with terror. "Where are you? Who's coming?" I asked, but there was no response. The silence was deafening. Determined to figure out what was happening, I traced the call using the office phone system. To my shock, the calls were coming from within the building, from the old, disused basement that was supposedly locked up years ago. Gathering my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the basement. The air grew colder as I descended the stairs, and the flickering light cast long, sinister shadows on the walls. The door to the basement was ajar, creaking open with a push. Inside, the room was filled with old office furniture and dusty files. In the corner, I saw an old rotary phone off the hook. As I approached it, the phone rang again, and I picked it up with trembling hands. "Please, help me," the woman's voice begged once more. "Where are you?" I demanded. But then I noticed something horrifying. The voice was not coming from the phone, it was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, and there she was, a ghostly figure of a woman, her eyes hollow and her expression filled with fear. She reached out to me, and I could feel the chill of her touch. "They're here," she whispered, and suddenly the room was filled with shadowy figures, their eyes glowing with malevolent intent. I ran out of the basement, the phone still ringing in my ears, and never looked back. The next day, I learned that a woman had been murdered in that basement years ago, her spirit trapped and calling for help ever since. The office building was sealed off after that, but sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the faint ring of a phone and her desperate pleas for help echoing in my mind. One summer, my friends and I decided to explore an abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. It was a dare, and we were eager for an adventure. The place was dilapidated, with graffiti-covered walls and broken windows. The air was thick with the scent of decay. We split up to cover more ground, each armed with flashlights. I ventured into the old patient rooms, feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness. Suddenly, I heard a blood-curdling scream from down the hall. I ran towards the sound and found one of my friends, pale and trembling, pointing towards a door. Inside, we found old photographs and medical records scattered on the floor. Among them was a photo of a young woman who looked eerily similar to the friend who had screamed. We later learned that she was a patient who had died under mysterious circumstances. As we were leaving, I felt a cold breath on my neck and heard a whisper, "Don't leave me." We never spoke of that night again, but each of us left with a piece of the asylum's sorrow etched into our memories. It was during a family reunion at my grandparents' old farmhouse that I experienced the most terrifying night of my life. The house was crowded, so I ended up sleeping in the attic, a space filled with old furniture and dusty antiques. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was one of my cousins, but the footsteps were too heavy. They circled the room and stopped right by my bed. I dared not open my eyes, paralyzed with fear. The next morning, I found claw marks on the wooden floor around my bed. My grandfather, seeing my pale face, pulled me aside. He told me about a spirit that haunted the attic, a former tenant who had died there under mysterious circumstances. The claw marks, he said, were a warning. I refused to sleep in that attic ever again. Years later, the house was sold, and the new owners reported strange occurrences. The spirit, it seems, was still waiting for its next victim. During a backpacking trip across Europe, I found myself staying at a quaint old inn in a small village. The place was charming, with rustic decor and a friendly innkeeper who warned me about one particular room that guests often found unsettling. Naturally, my curiosity got the best of me and I requested to stay in that very room. The room itself seemed normal at first glance, but as night fell, an eerie feeling washed over me. Around midnight, I heard faint crying coming from behind the walls. Assuming it was another guest, I tried to ignore it, but the crying grew louder and more desperate. Determined to find the source, I pressed my ear to the wall and felt a cold breeze. To my shock, the wall seemed to shift, revealing a hidden door. With trembling hands, I opened it to find a small, forgotten room filled with old toys and dusty furniture. In the corner sat a little girl, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. She looked at me and whispered, "Help me." Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me. I banged and shouted until the innkeeper came running. When he opened the door, the hidden room had vanished, leaving me alone in the original room. The innkeeper told me that the girl was the spirit of his daughter who had disappeared years ago. She was still searching for someone to free her from her eternal sorrow. My friends and I decided to spend a weekend at a remote cabin in the woods. The cabin was rustic but cozy, with a beautiful view of the surrounding forest. The caretaker, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, welcomed us warmly and gave us a tour, sharing stories about the cabin's history. The first night, we enjoyed a bonfire and listened to the sounds of nature. Around midnight, I went inside to grab more marshmallows and found Mr. Thompson sitting by the fireplace, staring into the flames. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with sadness, and said, "Be careful of the forest. It doesn't like visitors." The next morning, we couldn't find Mr. Thompson anywhere. We searched the cabin and the surrounding area, but found no trace of him. When we called the owner of the cabin, they were confused. They told us that Mr. Thompson had died 5 years ago in a forest accident. We were stunned and decided to leave immediately. As we packed our things, we found a note by the fireplace, written in Mr. Thompson's handwriting. "The forest is watching. Leave before it's too late." We never went back to that cabin again, haunted by the memory of the ghostly caretaker and his warning. At an antique shop in a small town, I stumbled upon a beautiful old mirror with an intricately carved frame. The shop owner seemed eager to sell it at a surprisingly low price. Excited by my find, I brought the mirror home and hung it in my living room. Almost immediately, strange things began to happen. I would catch glimpses of movement in the reflection, shadows darting behind me. One night, as I walked past the mirror, I saw a figure standing in the reflection, though no one else was in the room. Determined to uncover the truth, I researched the mirror's history. It had belonged to a woman accused of witchcraft in the 17th century. She was executed, but before she died, she cursed the mirror, vowing to haunt anyone who possessed it. The activity in my home grew more intense. I would wake up to find the mirror moved, or worse, see the figure standing beside my bed. Desperate, I tried to get rid of the mirror, but every time I threw it away, it reappeared in my home. I finally sought the help of a local paranormal expert who advised me to perform a cleansing ritual. With their guidance, I was able to break the curse and bury the mirror in consecrated ground. The haunting stopped, but I'll never forget the terror I experienced while the cursed mirror was in my home. In college, I lived in a small apartment near campus. It was an old building with creaky floors and thin walls, but it was affordable and convenient. One night, as I was studying late, I heard faint tapping on my window. Living on the 3rd floor, I dismissed it as tree branches or a bird. The tapping continued for several nights, always around the same time. One night, I decided to investigate and opened the window. To my horror, I saw a face staring back at me from the fire escape. It was a man with cold, empty eyes, watching me silently. I screamed and called the police, but by the time they arrived, the man had disappeared. They found no signs of forced entry and suggested it was probably a prank, but the tapping continued, now accompanied by whispers and the feeling of being watched. I started seeing the man everywhere, in reflections, shadows, even in my dreams. He never spoke, just watched with those cold eyes. Terrified, I moved out and stayed with friends until I could find a new place. I later learned that a man had died in that building years ago, and his spirit was known to haunt the apartments, silently stalking the living. While visiting my grandparents in their rural farmhouse, I often enjoyed the peace and quiet of the countryside. One night, however, I experienced something that still haunts me to this day. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard footsteps outside my window. Peeking through the curtains, I saw a figure walking slowly around the house. It was a man, but there was something off about him. His movements were unnatural, almost robotic. I watched in horror as he circled the house, stopping occasionally to look up at my window. His eyes were empty, and his expression was void of any emotion. I rushed to my grandparents' room, waking them up and telling them what I saw. My grandfather's face turned pale, and he immediately locked all the doors and windows. He told me about the Night Walker, a spirit that roamed the countryside, searching for lost souls to take with him. The legend said that if you looked into his eyes, he would steal your soul and drag you into the night. We stayed awake until dawn, and the Night Walker eventually disappeared. My grandparents performed a protective ritual, and I never saw the Night Walker again. But every night I still hear those footsteps in my nightmares, and I know he's out there, searching for his next victim. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the darkness. I hope these stories gave you the chills and kept you on the edge of your seat. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on more terrifying tales. Have you had any spooky encounters or know of any true horror stories? Share them in the comments below. I'd love to read them. Remember, the world is full of mysteries, and sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can't explain. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep an eye out for the things that go bump in the night. Sweet dreams.